I want to put two moments next to each other, and I want you to hold them both at once. Season 1. Tony Soprano gives a friend $50,000. Nobody asked him for it. Nobody would ever have known if he'd kept it in his pocket. He hands it over because the man is his friend, and profiting off a friend makes him feel like a bum. 8 years later, that same friend is sitting in his house with the woman he loved, lying dead in the next room. Tony gives him a paper bag full of cash and walks out the door. I have never been able to shake the distance between those two men. Let me tell you about Herman Rabkin. For a long time, I filed Hesh under kindly old man, the wise one. The guy with the horse farm who's seen it all and doesn't need anything from anybody. Then I sat with what the show actually tells you about where his money came from, and I stopped being able to see him that way. Hesh made his fortune in the record business. He founded a label called F-Note in the 50s and 60s. He brought a lot of young black musicians to prominence, and then he took royalties off their work by having himself credited as a co-writer on songs he had nothing to do with. The show states this outright. It's who he is. He's loosely modeled on Morris Levy, a real record mogul with real mob ties. The rest of his money came from standing very close to the Soprano family without ever being inside it. Hesh could never be a made man. He's Jewish, and that door was closed to him permanently. So he built something adjacent instead. He was Johnny Boy Soprano's loan shark and his advisor, and when Johnny Boy died, Hesh simply carried on doing the same work for the son. Watch how the show introduces him. Episode 1. He's helping Tony squeeze an HMO executive named Alex Mahaffey, a degenerate gambler buried in debt to both of them. Hesh and Big Pussy drive Mahaffey out to a bridge above a waterfall to frighten him into playing along. That's Hesh's job. He's who you call when muscle alone won't finish it. And still, he's the calm one. He's the man Tony drives out to at 11 at night to unload about New York, about the weight of it, about all of it. He's a father to Tony. He's a living wire back to Johnny Boy. And he's one of maybe 3 people alive that Tony can talk to without putting on a face. Here's the scene I keep coming back to. Season 1, Episode 6. Junior's the boss now, and Livia, furious at Tony for moving her into Greengrove, whispers in Junior's ear that Hesh has been getting a free ride for 30 years. So Junior taxes him for the first time in 3 decades, and Hesh has no protection at all. He never took the oath. That was the whole arrangement he made with himself decades ago, and this is the day the bill arrives. So Hesh goes looking for Tony, and he finds him at Satrial's, playing cards in the back with his capos. And Hesh doesn't go in. He waits and asks to speak with Tony privately, and the two of them talk outside. Hold on to that. The room, and the fact that Hesh stayed out of it. We're coming back to both. Tony goes to bat for him. He pulls in Johnny Sack, the underboss of the Lupertazzi family in New York, to lean on Junior and get the number down. Then he talks Junior into passing Hesh's tribute money down to the capos, $50,000 apiece. And then Tony takes his $50,000, drives out to Hesh's, and gives it back to him. Hesh never asked. Hesh would never have found out. I love that scene. I also think it gets misread, because it doesn't mean money is unimportant to Tony. Money is enormous to Tony. Season 2. Davey Scatino, a guy Tony went to high school with, begs his way into the executive game. Tony waves him off more than once. Davey won't listen, so Tony stakes him $5,000 to sit down. And by sunrise, Davey is down $45,000. Then Tony bleeds him. He busts out Davey's sporting goods store using its own line of credit until the place is bankrupt and the repo men are walking the aisles. He takes Davey's son's car as partial payment and hands it to Meadow. And when Davey is falling apart in front of him, close to suicide, Tony tells him the game was fair and he could just as easily have won. So Tony keeps 2 lists. There are people he loves, and they never pay. And there are people he's decided are fair game, and they pay until there's nothing left of them. The question this whole story asks is what happens to a man who gets moved from one list to the other. Episode 81, Chasing It. Written by Matthew Weiner, directed by Tim Van Patten, 4 hours into the final stretch of the show. Tony's gambling, roulette, the track, football, losing it all of it, and the deeper he goes, the harder he bets. The week before, he'd gone to Hesh for $200,000 and called it a bridge loan. And Hesh, a professional loan shark, a man who has charged interest his whole adult life, gives the boss of New Jersey $200,000 with no vig on it whatsoever, because that's what you do for family. Then Tony says nothing about it. Weeks go by. Eventually, Tony drives out there with a gift, a Cleaver baseball cap, merchandise from Christopher's movie. Hesh tosses it aside and says, gently, that he'd been hoping for something else, some of that $200,000. And Tony acts like he's forgotten the loan ever happened. Then he starts pushing vig at him, $3,000 a week. This is the part that turns my stomach. Hesh never wanted interest. He tells Tony he doesn't want a vig from him in about as plain a sentence as a man can build. Tony pushes it anyway, because he's decided to put a price on the thing between them. Once there's a weekly number attached, it stops being a favor between family and becomes a tab. Then Hesh comes to Satrial's and sits in on the poker game, that same back room he wouldn't walk into 6 seasons earlier. Now he's inside it, at the table, and everybody there knows why he's come. And Tony calls him a Shylock in front of the entire crew. After that, Hesh is frightened. He says it out loud to his son-in-law. He wonders whether it gets cheaper for Tony to settle this some other way. And he isn't imagining things. That same season, Tony has already taken Paulie out on a boat and turned over whether to kill him. Then, Tony and Bobby drive out to Hesh's house unannounced. Tony's got the vig in hand, $3,000 in cash, and an invitation. He wants Hesh to come out to a boat show with them. Hesh tells him again that he can't take the money, that Tony should pay him whenever he can. Tony leaves it with him anyway, and on the boat show, Hesh says he'd love to, but Renata's got a migraine. The show never confirms that Hesh smelled anything. I brought that suspicion into the scene myself, because I remember what happened to Big Pussy on a boat, and I'd guess you do too. Now let me argue against myself, because I think this episode is doing something more interesting than showing us that Tony is a bastard. In the car on the way home, Tony complains to Bobby and Carlo, and I want you to hear what actually offends him. He had to drive all the way out there. He had to hand over the vig in person. He is sincerely indignant that repaying his own debt cost him an afternoon. And Bobby says, tell him to go to hell and keep the 200 grand. What's he gonna do about it? And here's the beat I think most people misremember. Tony says no. He shuts it down flat. Then he gives his reason, and the reason is that he's the head of the family and it would look bad. Then Carlo says the quiet part. Who's gonna know? And Tony explodes at him about something else entirely. Carlo's construction numbers, of all things. He detonates sideways because the suggestion got in. Some last scrap of him knows it got in, and he can't stand it. Then he goes to therapy, and this is where I start to feel something other than disgust. He opens by making a run of ugly cracks to Melfi about Jews and money. The show is not remotely subtle that his turn on Hesh arrives wrapped in bigotry. Melfi asks him what he's chasing, the money or the high of winning. And then, before the hour is up, she brings up how many appointments he's been missing. So that's 2 rooms in one story. The only 2 places on Earth where Tony gets taken care of without having to earn it. And in both of them, somebody quietly attaches a condition. Melfi, his surrogate mother. Hesh, his surrogate father. Most of us would absorb that and get on with our week. Tony was raised by a woman who handed out affection like it was rationed. And I think anything with a condition attached lands on him as a door closing. So he goes and gambles harder, because gambling is the last room left where the universe might still tell him he's special. And there's a production choice here I love. The whole hour is shot with a deliberately unsteady handheld camera, with 2 documented exceptions. Melfi's office and the inside of Tony's car. The 2 rooms nobody can reach him in. The camera is quietly telling you where the floor has gone. Underneath every bit of this is Johnny Boy. Season 3. Tony's standing at his mother's fridge eating capicola, and it triggers a memory. He's a kid again, watching his father and Uncle Junior drag Mr. Satriali into the back room of his own butcher shop, and Johnny Boy takes a meat cleaver to the old man's pinky finger. Satriali's crime was gambling. He got in over his head, he owed Johnny Boy money, and he ducked him. At dinner that night, Johnny Boy explains it to his son. Mr. Satriali is a lovely man and a degenerate gambler who wouldn't pay what he owed. And then the lesson, twice in case it didn't take. Never gamble, Anthony. Sit with that. The pork store where Tony holds court for 8 years, the room where he humiliates Hesh over a debt, is named after a man his father mutilated over a debt. And when Tony tells Melfi about it decades later, he says watching it gave him a rush. Then, Season 5. In Camelot, Tony meets Fran Felstein, his father's longtime mistress, and learns that on the night his mother was in the hospital after a miscarriage, Johnny Boy was with Fran, and that his father made him, at 16, lie to his mother about where he'd been. That's the year the saint dies for Tony. So look at what he does in the final season with all of that sitting in his chest. Never gamble. He puts $200,000 into a hole. Pay what you owe. He sits on it. Honor your father's oldest friend, a man he never chose and simply inherited, like a piece of furniture. He turns on him. He comes within inches of killing Polly, the other living wire back to Johnny Boy. He kills Christopher, the closest thing he ever had to a son. He takes apart everything his father built or touched, one piece at a time, and he acts every bit of it out without ever getting near saying it out loud. If Melfi laid it in front of him in plain English, he'd wave it off and change the subject. That's the part I find unbearably sad about him. Before we get to the last scene, I have to be fair, because I don't think the show wants me handing you a clean victim. Hesh Rabkin is not a nice man. He built his fortune on artists whose names ended up underneath his on the songwriting credits. He spent 50 years using the threat of the Soprano family as free security, with clean hands and no oath and no real exposure. Nobody ever moved on Hesh, because moving on Hesh meant moving on Tony. And in Camelot, Fran tells Tony that two men cheated her out of a racetrack stake Johnny Boy meant her to have. One of them was Phil Leotardo. The other one was Hesh. Tony takes it seriously enough that he sits both of them down over it. Then there's the thing I keep circling back to. When a young Tony Soprano needed teaching, how you scheme, how you squeeze, how you turn another man's desperation into money, Hesh was one of the teachers. He had a hand in building the man who walks out of that house. Then Renata dies. In her sleep, out of nowhere, a stroke. And I want to put a stake through a theory here, because it keeps coming around. Tony didn't do it. No botched hit, no arrangement, nothing. It was biology and bad luck, and it had nothing to do with him, which is what makes it land the way it does for me. Everyone else who gets close to this family, Mahaffey, Davey, Salvitro, pays a price the mob puts on them directly. Renata just died. Tony can't even hide behind the life on this one. He comes to the house. Hesh is destroyed. He can barely hold himself together, and Tony offers him a couple of cliches. She was a great girl. Then he hands over the bag. 4 words. I brought your money. And then, sorry for your loss. Listen to the order of that. He splits the condolence in half and slides $200,000 into the middle of it, the way you'd hide a pill in a piece of cheese. He doesn't stay, doesn't sit down with him, doesn't sit Shiva, doesn't come near it, doesn't bring so much as a tray of food from Carmela, which in the world of this show is the lowest bar there is. It's what you do for people you barely like. He settles up and he goes. Hesh got his 200 grand back, and it cost him the only protection he'd ever really had. And we never see him again. When I think about Tony Soprano now, I think about 2 handoffs of cash, 8 years apart. One he drove across town to give away, to prove a friendship was worth more than the money. One he carried into a house of mourning on his way out the door. That's the whole fall, right there. And it never needed a single gunshot to happen. So tell me honestly, watching that last scene, did you feel sorry for Hesh? Or were you thinking about the 50 years he spent earning that seat? I've got a feeling this one splits us down the middle. Let me know in the comments.